morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 21st September. It will be sunny with highs of 13 degrees Celsius or 55 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:36 a.m. and sunset at 6:54 p.m. We are on the 52nd day of the Warsaw Uprising, and today are the last airdrops by the Allies, which is hard for the insurgents, but otherwise, what else is happening on the ground?
Yeah, thanks for that, Filip. I'm going to start today with a story about Tadeusz Szabelski. Of course, we want to talk about insurgents and we want to make this a little bit more human, this story, and bring out the human element of this podcast. So Tadeusz Szabelski was born in Warsaw in 1920. He came from a working class family. His father was a tailor. His mother was a housewife. And before the war, he actually began his studies at the Warsaw University of Technology. And his studies were interrupted by the outbreak of war. Now, he only joined the Home Army in 1943. Which is a little bit late, after the formation of his company, and he became a soldier of the 3rd Platoon. From February 1944, he became the deputy commander of one of the companies, and he was involved in 2 major combat actions, one being Action Pochocin, and this is a combat action where they derailed a train that was on the Warsaw to Poznań route. Basically, German soldiers were returning from the Eastern Front from Warsaw towards Poznań, and then towards Germany. And the second one he took part in was Action Kop, which is the assassination of SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Kop, and it failed actually. This action failed because Kop escaped the assaults on his car and he was only wounded, but quite a few Germans died and there was one wounded insurgent, and this actually took part in Kraków. It didn't take place, it was a unit from Warsaw that went to Kraków that took part in this action, and on their way back they faced some huge difficulties. Now, Tadeusz didn't directly participate, he wasn't in Kraków, but he was involved in securing the men and the women who went to Kraków with documents, basically falsified documents and vehicles that they needed to make their journey. He married Krystyna Szabelska, and just a little bit about her. Before the war, she was a scouting leader a women's scouting leader in Warsaw, and then during the occupation she was the commander of the women's group in Praga, which is the other side of Warsaw. We've spoken about it, that's where the Soviets are currently sitting, in the small sabotage in the Wawer organisation, where they would go out and they would do small sabotage, so painting graffiti, anti-German graffiti on the walls, or, disrupting the Germans day to day. So it was a very important organisation, but she was the head of that organisation. And just before the Warsaw Uprising, she joined the battalion Parasol, which is the same battalion that her husband fought in, from 1944, and her role there was a messenger, and she worked there together with her husband Tadeusz. Now, she also had a brother, Zbigniew Wiśniewski. Her maiden name was Wiśniewska, and he was also the same soldier of the same battalion, but he was shot during an action in April of 1944. Now, Krystyna took an active part in preparing for the COP action. She actually obtained the necessary forms, the samples of the seals and signatures. She helped forge the documents that the Home Army needed to complete this action. During the Warsaw Uprising, Tadeusz, he was a deputy commander for Parasol. He took part in all the battles that this battalion took part in, all the way from Wola to the Old Town to Czerniaków. Now, his wife, as I've mentioned before, was in the same battalion and they did fight together. She was a messenger, he was a soldier, and it's on this day, on this specific day, that they both die. They died together in the defence of a building on Wilanowska Street, and they were both shot, and they are both buried together in Powązki Military Cemetery. So that is my story of today for today's day. And this is a story as like yesterday. We will hear husband and wives losing their lives together, maybe not at the same time. In this specific example, we have that they lost their lives together and they got married before the Warsaw Uprising. So moving on very quickly onto what's happening on the ground. Well, there are only 2 buildings remaining in the insurgent hands in Czerniaków. That is a building on Wilanowska and Solec. So the last 2 remaining buildings that are in the insurgent hands. And as we very well know, Krystyna and Tadeusz lost their lives fighting for another building on Wilanowska Street, but there's only one left, and one in Solec. As I mentioned yesterday and the day before and the day before, we are now battling for building to building, floor to floor, and room to room. Now, the Soviets are now shelling the Powiśle, the Czerniaków district, and other districts that are under German control. And then the Soviets are also bombing places like the Citadel, the main train station, parts of Czerniaków, and other areas that are actually both under insurgent and German command here. Now, Żoliborz is also trying to defend itself and make attacks onto the Germans. Unfortunately, the fortifications of captured positions are destroyed, and then they have to basically retreat. They attack the German 25th Panzer Division, but the Germans fight back and they eliminated those soldiers in Żoliborz that tried to attack them. And those that survived, which were mostly wounded, were actually evacuated to the left-hand side, so the Praga part of the River Vistula. And we'll hear this a lot where we have a lot of evacuations happening. Not always successful, but they do happen. Now, the military situation is not the only thing that is happening on the ground. Claire, the situation in the districts that are being held by the insurgents are extremely dire, aren't they?
Yeah, so just to catch up on what the situation is like for the soldiers and the civilians now on the ground, or in fact under the ground, where most of the civilians are still sheltering. And of course, the bombs are going right through. So a lot of the basements themselves are now buried under rubble. Even the people that are physically okay are basically starving at this point. I mean, you need to remember that the Home Army had done incredibly well to create supplies, caches of supplies to last them for 2 weeks. They thought they were only going to last 2 days. But then a number of those caches of food and medical supplies were in areas that they never managed to regain. So some of those were out of bounds, and everything else has gone. Everything at this point has gone. So ammunition has gone, fine. Food has gone. There isn't even water. There's no clean water. There are people making extremely risky trips down to the river in the evenings, which are now all organised, but daytime visits down are just too dangerous. And even at night, people are being shot and killed while they're trying to get water in whatever objects they can to carry it. There's no medical supplies left to help the wounded, which literally means people are just slowly dying with sympathy as the only thing they're being given. Those people who are surviving are just trying to scavenge to support themselves, and some of those around them. A few strong individuals are still coordinating support. Zoe is still working. She is trying to organise whatever supplies she can, and that is partially just taking any supplies from field hospitals or community kitchens that have been bombed and may have any residue left and bringing them to where they can still be used. Taking any tins and other supplies that might have been saved by those people who have been recently killed. So there's constant scavenging among the ruins, especially at the night. And of course, there is disease. Disease always follows fast on the heels of starvation and lack of sanitation. So people are doing their best to bury the dead. They're doing it with as much respect as possible, wrapping them in newspaper, bits of paper. But largely, there are still mass graves, but there are a lot of bodies that people just can't reach, and they don't have the strength to reach them, that are trapped between the ruins of buildings. And so the whole city now reeks of decay, and the air is, late summer now, still buzzing with blue bottles. Alina, you've got a personal story, haven't you, here?
I do, actually. I'm sorry that I'm laughing in the situation, but it's only because when I spoke to Halina Paszkowska about this, we spoke about her in episode 1, she just laughed the whole way through the story. So it really brings back fond memories of her telling me all about this. And it's also quite disgusting, but at the same time, I can't stop laughing, reliving this memory with her. I just can't stop laughing at her story. Coming back to what you said, insurgents and civilians were scavenging for food, for everything and anything that they can. And she came across a big, this kind of big jug of vitamins. And she got so excited. It was the best thing that she'd found that day. And she hurried back to her guys, and they opened this big can of vitamins and they poured it into some water, mixed it up, drank it. And she remembered that moment that she drank these vitamins, and she screwed up her face. And she said it was the most vile thing that she'd ever drunk in her life. When they actually read the box, because she hadn't read the box, she grabbed this jug of vitamins, And when they actually read the box, it basically stated that they were horse vitamins. And I can understand why and how it was just incredibly vile. But it's something. It was anything that they could eat, anything they could put into their body. I mean, she hadn't eaten for days, and this was something they just needed it. Anything to be able to eat, to drink, to put into their body.
Still filling their stomach. And of course, there was that real sense of gallows humour. When you have been through this, everyone there is deeply traumatized, but there is that need to keep going. And one of the great ways you can keep going is by laughing, even in the horror of it all. So yeah, that's a brilliant story.
So Claire, I just want to continue this basically, because you mentioned disease, death, mass graves. What did Warsaw look like, and were there places for people to be able to be buried? What happened in this context?
Very early on, initially, they had used the parks. I mean, even, 1939, we have these accounts after the defence of Warsaw, and then at the start of the occupation, the parks, which were, immaculate. Warsaw was, the Paris of the East, absolutely beautiful city, and now all the parks are scabbed with, hastily dug graves. But very quickly, those sites, I mean, they themselves are, everything is bombed from the air. I mean, the city is hugely destroyed at this point. Any backyards, gardens, all of that have been, used both for burial, but also for any cultivation that is possible. Trying to keep those things apart, of course. But now you get, in a beautiful city like this, there used to be trees planted along to create shade for the avenues. Now there are no trees left. There's few dead sticks left. But in those spaces, anything like that has been dug up. So along the sides of the roads, you get a few wooden crosses and then just upright sticks going down, because every space they're avenues of graves. It's a city of graves. Sometimes people are buried with identifying items. You get crosses with names on. People are buried with their ken cards, their identity papers, wartime identity papers, diaries, letters, anything, so that when people are still hoping that after the uprising, after the war, they may be dug up and identified and may be reburied. There are great attempts to give dignity to the process of burial and to enable people to be identified. But of course, it's not always possible. And there are thousands of unidentified graves across the city.
And we have a great testimony from Henryk Gąska. I'm going to let him tell you the story, but just to give a bit of context, he was wounded in the first few days of the uprising. He was hit in the arm and the left lung. And then when he was in hospital, the hospital was hit by a bomb, and he was hit in the head by flying bricks and suffered a head wound. So hopefully that will make a little bit more sense to what he's talking about. So I'll let him tell you.
It was depressing when someone died. That was often. To this day, I visit my own grave at Marszałkowska 42. I had the last rites, and when I woke up, they were holding candles, and the priest oiled my feet. As my friends were leaving, they dug a grave for me, just in case. And it was hard to dig a grave because most places in the tenement houses were paved. I didn't give in. There was a young man, 17, 18 years old. His mother brought him in. He got hit in the forehead. He was lying unconscious and died that night. The mother didn't know where to bury him, so she came to me and said, "You have a grave there. Like it will be at the bottom, and I will leave the rest. You can be together there if anything happens." I said, "Very good," and I agreed. To this day, I come to that grave at Marszałkowska 42. You have to go a bit further now because there is a new building. The old one was destroyed. I went to my own grave, which was dug for me, and someone else was buried there.
That's a very powerful testimony. Somebody who had their own grave dug for them, and then in the later years post-war goes back to his grave as often as he can. I find that incredible. But coming back to the subject, do either of you find this, but when you walk through a cemetery, I mean, well, all three of us do this quite often, but I spend a lot of time doing tours around various cemeteries in Warsaw, and even when I go on my own, you walk amongst some of the graves and you just see the words unknown, unknown, unknown. And I've mentioned this before, that it just really hits you in the face. You have sometimes mass graves of unknown 53 people, unknown 150 people, unknown 600 people. Sometimes it could just be a a number, an age. And for me, it's always been my life's mission to try and identify all of these unknown people that died in the Warsaw Uprising. It's something that you'd need a lot of money for. But at the end of the day, it breaks my heart when you see somebody who's 15 years old, unknown, 10 years old, unknown, and all you can do is identify what that person was wearing, how old they were, and maybe something that they had in their pocket, and that's everything that you have.
But there was an exhibition I remember seeing at the Warsaw Rising Museum, a lot of the documentation for the post-war exhumations. So it relates directly to this, Claire. And they had a lot of these notes that said on them, male, late teens, wearing a blue coat, whatever it would be. And the vast majority had under name, they had NN. So, which is, I'm sure Alina will tell us what that is in Polish, but it basically means known without a name, not known. And that I remember being, astonished by that. But it's 'twas ever thus in a way, because if you go back to the First World War, I think the figures there, astonishingly, I think it's a third of Allied casualties. They're not only not known, but there's no body. I mean, the bodies disappear. I mean, that's the chaos of war is a hideous thing, and all those sort of normal elements that we imagine of life and respect for the person and so on, everything goes out the window. So in a sense, we have to bear all of that in mind. It's a different world.
So just quickly, NN means unknown, but it's actually Latin, nomen nescio, which is abbreviated to NN. It's basically letting the reader know that this person is anonymous, well, pretty much that they don't have a name. And it basically means nomen, name, and nesco, I do not know. So it literally means I do not know the name of this person. And I'm not sure if it's used in other countries, but in Poland for sure, NN, you'll see it everywhere in all cemeteries, and a lot of the time sometimes on plaques where you'll only, for example, have the code name that they would only know by, or maybe just their name, no code name, or only first name or surname, or it depends really on how much information is known about this person. So you might just have no information or just a tiny bit of information about this person.
And there is, you're right, because I have also seen a lot of work done to, in the last decade really, to go in and find certain grave areas and to do identity work where it's possible. But of course, after the war, we have this Soviet-backed communist regime come in, establish government. And what you find with the rebuilding of Warsaw, you find that all of the new buildings, they don't have basements. People are not digging down because they know everywhere underneath the city, this is what they're going to find. So you get, some of the older buildings still had their basements. They were rebuilt according to the old plans. And, Warsaw is now a UNESCO heritage centre because they've rebuilt the city, the beautiful old town, according to the old plans. But they didn't dig down in the same way because everyone knows what lies below.
And that's very clear. The area of again, Alina knows this better than us, but the area of the former ghetto, they built basically on top of the rubble. And you can see the blocks are built up on sort of slight, sort of 4-foot rise, which is basically the rubble of the former ghetto and everything else. And as you say, there was little sense and desire to sort of dig down to because they kind of knew what was there, and this was about rebuilding Warsaw.
Yeah, so the Warsaw Ghetto is quite unique really in itself because, as Claire said, they just built straight on top of it. And under the rubble, basically, it's more or less untouched. There are still excavations happening now. There was a very well-known excavation that happened last year in a section of the former ghetto where they discovered the foundations in a basement of a pre-war tenement house, along with wooden floors and also like a production of a factory of cutlery and metalworks. There's also extensive networks of tunnels and corridors of where many people who were escaping during the ghetto uprising had died. The ground is just one huge cemetery. There have never been systematic exhumations that have been carried out there. And this is it. When they start redoing or digging or bringing down a building and rebuilding buildings, which is what they're still doing, they do find corpses. And what's really interesting is that our Arcadia shopping mall up in the northern part, there was a mass grave found there when they were building it, when they were excavating around it. The thing is, this side is already outside of the ghetto, but there are telltale signs during the excavation that they are Jews that were shot at Umstangplatz, basically the deportation place where Jews were deported to Treblinka, and that the Germans had shot them and buried the bodies there. And underneath, in the basements, there are corpses, there are parts of daily life, there are personal objects, sometimes manuscripts are discovered, obviously maybe not in a very well preserved way, but yeah, it's a really interesting subject that we should really start talking more about.
Interesting. Okay, moving on. There's an interesting document that emerges on 21st of September in Moscow, which we will talk about, and it foreshadows the attitude that the Soviets later took towards the Home Army, which is kind of interesting. So there was a document, a report that came out of a lieutenant in the People's Army who had been in Warsaw and had gone back to report to his superiors, and he had reported that General Komorowski, the head of the Home Army in Warsaw, had supposedly these secret orders which included extermination. Now, it doesn't necessarily say extermination of whom, but it included extermination, presumably targeting members of the People's Army, and that rather stark division between what we might broadly call Polish forces. And the criticism that comes out of that, obviously humanitarian, but at the same time it says this exposes the politics of Bohr and the London government as harmful to Poland, it says, and it calls for the unification of all Polish national forces to fight the Germans on the basis of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Now, of course, we know that there's quite a lot wrong with that sort of propaganda exclamation, because we know that cooperation with the Soviet Union very often, if you weren't the same ideological bent as them, it usually ended up with you being arrested and disarmed and sent to some sort of prison camp or the Gulag or worse. So there's much to criticize in that. But what's interesting about it, I think, is how it sort of foreshadows the way that Home Army soldiers and veterans were dealt with in the post-war period under communist Poland, because very, very often they were accused of collaboration with the Nazis as collaborators, which, of course, as we've described in this podcast, and as our listeners will know, they absolutely weren't collaborators with the Nazis or anything but. But that's how the Soviet system decided to treat them. And if you look at the cases, some of those notable cases, people like General Fieldorf, who was executed in, I think, as late as early 1953, Witold Pilecki, again, very famous case. And most famously, you look at the case of Kazimierz Mocharski, who wrote a brilliant book called Conversations with an Executioner. Now, he was arrested. He was a Home Army soldier. He was arrested post-war under the communist regime, and he was thrown into a cell with none other than Jürgen Stroop, who was the German general who had masterminded and overseen the suppression of the ghetto rising in Warsaw in 1943. So they were putting in Home Army soldiers with actual Nazis, essentially because to the Soviet mind, they were all the same thing. Right, they were all opponents of communism. And Mocharski's book is an astonishing account of his conversations with Stroop over a good few months, actually, with Stroop being very kind of reflective about his own career and his beliefs and all of this sort of thing, and Mocharski kind of as far as was possible, sort of noting this down or remembering it as best he could. And it was published, I think it was published first in the 70s, but it's an absolutely amazing book, and it's really due for republication if that's going to be possible. But this account I mentioned from Moscow is really interesting because it does sort of foreshadow that ideological divide, where the Soviets are basically lumping in, whether for propaganda purposes or not, but they're just lumping in the Home Army along with the Nazis as those interested in extermination and enemies of mankind, as they would have seen it. So it's quite an interesting development.
And thank you so much for joining us for day 52, and please join us tomorrow for day 53. Remember, if you like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. Thank you to everybody on Spotify and to those who've rated us on Apple. It'd be amazing. Any more Apple listeners, it would be great to get your 5-star reviews. Well, if you like us anyway. But thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow for episode 53.